All right, we left off yesterday talking about piston pins, which is what I just said, but I didn't have the thing rolling. So piston pins, or no, we call it piston pins. And that we finished that, so that brings me to the fact that we have in aircraft full floating piston pins that ride in the piston and connecting rod, hopefully, and means they float back and forth, which means that they are free to touch the cylinder wall on either side. So that means that, let me see, we talk about piston pin retainers. The piston pin retainers. Piston pin retainers. Which is kind of a weird thing to write, considering what we have, but it'll make sense. So a piston pin retainer would keep the piston pin from hitting the cylinder wall. So that would keep pin from damaging or hitting cylinder wall. Cylinder wall. You can do it a couple of ways. You could put circlets, CIRCLETS. That's another name for snap ring. It'd be something, I actually wrote that. It would fit in the groove. Fit in a groove of a piston. So what you would do is take a piston. They would have a little groove just cut out right inside the piston pin boss. Piston pin would go in, fit inside that. You take a snap ring, pop it in there. Snap ring goes here, snap ring goes here. Piston can float around and bump into the snap ring, bump into the snap ring. I want to say like Franklin's had them or something. I know I've seen some aircraft that had it, but just like a snap ring right there, it goes into a little groove inside there and holds it. So that would be one way to do it, but Continental Lycoming do not do it that way. They use piston pin plugs. You did what in your plug? Piston pin plugs, and that would be the most common thing to have. They are made out of a non-ferrous material. What does that mean?
Anti-magnetized.
Which means it's made out of non-iron. So here's the fun part. If I can get this even remotely correct, not really matter if I get it correct or not, but it's, let's see here. Piston pins and piston pin plugs. We'll start with big bore Continental. These are interesting. Number one, you carry one in your pocket. That when it starts to go down, you got something like a roll of quarters, I guess. It doesn't, I think a roll of quarters would be a lot cheaper. A roll of dollar bills would be a lot cheaper. These are weird. And you've got the piston pin, just, high strength steel piston pin with non-ferrous plugs. This plug is one piece. It is made, and it goes all the way through the core and out to this side. And I had one that broke one time. I wish I could find it. We'd actually pop it apart and you'd see where it broke in the middle. It's weird, but these plugs right here, they're aluminum and they'll go back and forth. You can see where it rubs. And to the best of my knowledge, I never experienced a problem with these ever. No problems whatsoever. When you get into the small Continentals, the 300s, 0300s and down, the plugs are very similar to what you have in your 290. It's just a little cap that fits in there. If you go way back, like surplus stuff, they're really kind of loose. When you buy them from Continental, they're not a separate part number. It's one part number, and those pins are pressed in reasonably well. But I have experienced problems with them. We had a customer one time who had a high level of aluminum, and I don't remember exactly what made us do it, but we pulled the cylinders off looking for the aluminum, and one of the piston pin plugs, not this one, the small Continental, you know those little candies you get at Easter that are like Hershey's Kisses, but they're shaped like a football? It looked exactly like that. Same size, it didn't taste the same, but it took a plug and just, I don't know how it did it, but it came out a little tiny football. It's the coolest looking thing. I mean, it's expensive for the customer, but whatever. So these are one piece. If they ever come apart, well, you're doing. Then we have switch over to Lycoming. So these are the Continental ones right here. That's a single piece. There's the small Continental, and those plugs are pressed in there pretty good, to the point where you don't take them out. Sometimes I've tried to take them out, when I'm not going to use them. They're in there pretty dang good. Then there's Lycoming. And kind of as the story goes, let's see. You have three different types here. We'll start with this one, the 72198 aluminum bronze. It's actually kind of a goldish color. And it's the exact same outer diameter as a piston pin. And so the pin is reasonably short, and that cap would slide into the piston on this side, slide in the piston on that side. And there you go. And that was the old way they did things a long time ago. And they worked really well. And then, I don't remember if they went to this one on the left or the right first, but they doesn't matter. They changed it. They go, well, we're going to go to, I'm pretty sure it's this one. They went to the aluminum piston pin. It's the same thing, but they went to all aluminum. Well, they had problems with that one, and it started making metal and wouldn't do what they wanted it to do, so they came up with a solution. They went over to the 11775 aluminum piston pin plug, which pilots inside of the piston pin plug. Well, they had a lot of problems with that one, so the solution was, let's make an aluminum bronze one. I call it 72198, and they went to this one, and problem stopped. So, but there was full circle, just like the oil pump in a way, but that wasn't quite true. Let's see. But I have this up here because there was a problem. I don't think anymore you'd run into this problem, but these are not necessarily interchangeable. So like if you take a cylinder off and you have to change a piston pin plugs, you have to know what it is, and it has to match the other side. So in individual cylinders, replace both. Both in complete engines, replace all. So you can do like an individual cylinder with these to balance the other side, but you have to do this in the whole engine, and these are removed from service, and you put those. So it's just it was a mess. So oh yeah, we used this already in class, so we got that. I guess the reason why I have that in there is to remind you to don't beat them out, because it just bends the rods, and that's just not a nice thing. What else do I got? I'll come back to that. All right, so piston pin plugs. I don't know what's the takeaway from that. Make sure you know what you're using. Use the right one in a Lycoming. Look at the service instruction, which means that, can you go to the parts catalog and just look? No, isn't that kind of weird? So I don't want to say I got into an argument, but I got into a questioning of a self-proclaimed expert on the internet. And it was about how you had to check conformity of an aircraft in accordance with the parts manual. And that as long as it was in the parts manual, it was perfectly legal and acceptable. It was a weird way to put it, but I was like, that's very interesting. Could you please show me your data source that says that a parts book is FAA approved? No, that's what I said. It was something like, that's really interesting, because on the front page of the overhaul manual, it said, and all the rest of it, it says approved by the FAA. And I said, well, but when you go to a parts book, which I don't think is in here, it does not say that it's approved by the FAA. So therefore, how could you follow that rabbit trail and say that as long as it's a parts book, the airplane must match the parts book? Because as you've already seen, your engine does not match the parts book because it's so old, and it's the latest version. And it's like, well, they haven't used that for 40 years, but yet it's the latest version. So I don't know, his answer was, well, you really have to go into the FAA office and the order and the training that they have, which followed some other thing that we don't have access to. And I'm like, okay, good to know. So I kind of said, yeah, not really. I threw this in here because I think it's interesting. And it's applicable to, I'm going to say pin, piston, pin, fit. I don't know why I put it here, but I think it's because piston pins are such a highly polished surface, and they're, it works for this. So usually, a push fit. That's right out of the manual. They call it a push fit. What does that mean? It means you kind of have to push it in, not with a tool, but press with your hand. So, which brings up the point that anything that has a clearance of about 0.001, this is me, is about the smallest clearance you can assemble without a press. In other words, by hand, unless you were to heat one and cool the other. You'd have to heat the part that goes in so it expands, cool the part the inside part so it shrinks, lubricate it, put it in, and when they are match temperature, you probably wouldn't get it out without a hammer or some sort of press. So about 1,000th, same temperature, a little bit of lubricant, you should be able to slide it in. 0.002, we'll have easy sliding. With no perceivable let me say, side play or play. I'll just say play. Which is to say, if I put this in this piston, which is not going to go in there. If I put this in and it just slid in, and boy, I could press it one way and press it the other with my fingers, but I had to push kind of hard both ways. It's about 1,000. If I could put it in there and just kind of with my fingers go back and forth reasonably easy, but when it's like half in, half out, I don't really feel much play in there. Very, very, almost no wiggle whatsoever. That's about 2,000ths. And then once you get into 3, you will notice some play. So if it's in there and you're like, oh, I feel a little wiggle, that's about 3,000ths. So if you're curious. Can't really write that in the book. Wall thickness. Well, that brings up a disappointing topic. As I'm going around and checking your measurements, we start right off with something about what is the crank in mains in main bearings. Main bearings and crankshaft. So it's how the crankshaft fits in the main bearings. And you're given some dimensions. Well, they give you 2 sets of dimensions. One is if you have thin wall bearings, and one is if you have thick wall bearings. And so far, nobody has actually bothered to tell me. I'm like, well, maybe group 1 did. I think you guys did. First group I did. You were like, yeah, which ones do you have? And they said, oh, we're 0.16. Huh? Was it you guys? But the next one was like, a couple of you have been like, huh? I'm like, yeah, right there. I don't know. We never bothered to measure. Just measure. Wall thickness as applies to piston pins. What do I got here? Do I have? Well, that one works. Lycoming does talk about, that's the thickness of this right here, that part. They have heavy wall and thin wall, so you got to know which one you're doing. The thick wall, like I said, they're thick. So we'll just say that. Wall thickness, I'll just leave it at that. There's thin and thick. You have thick, and thin. What happens if you put a thin on one side and a thick on the other?
On balance?
Yeah, it's going to be out of balance. Let's see. Oh, why do I do this? I get back into piston pin plugs. But I think we covered that just fine. Large bore TCM piston pins with non-removable plugs. Small bore use tight fit. Lycoming has several different types. Good enough. Just keeps me in line. So we talked about all that. Now let's talk about cylinder barrels. All right. Cylinder barrels. Well, of course, I have to write this. Made of low strength. No, high strength. High strength steel. Well, of course, I'm talking about the bottom part then, not the top part. The top part would be high strength aluminum. This bottom is high strength steel. And it is threaded up into the head. And when I worked on cylinders, code, I can tell my code. If you bring a cylinder, I'm like, oh, I worked on that one. How do you know? I know. I marked them. And we would always mark the head to barrel junction with something, a little vibropene or a little punch or something, 2 marks, because when you heat them up, they start to get loose. And if you have it twist, and that means when it bolts back onto the engine, and the head is twisted, well, everything would be out of alignment. To the point where sometimes you can't get the one on next to it. So got to make sure they don't twist. And so they twist when you get them hot. They're put together hot, and got to be careful with that. So high strength steel, obviously it has cooling fins to dissipate heat. It's very difficult to remember what you're allowed and what you're not allowed on cooling fins, because Continental does one thing, Lycoming does another. One of them is if the fin is bent like halfway to the next, you have to reject the cylinder, absolutely no straightening. Another one allows a little bit of straightening. One, if the fin is cracked, you break it off. Like one, you don't. They're both back and forth. So what's the saying I have now? Don't memorize something you can look up. Memorize where to look it up. Surface. The interior surface, that is. Materials, we have the non-plated, meaning non-chrome, basically. Well, that's going to come in several different types. We have the plain steel. And we have the nitrided. All right, so plain steel, I can't think of any pluses on that one. Oh, I can't, yeah. I didn't write it. So that's going to have poor wear characteristics. And I'm going to say, even though it wasn't something that it's in the book, it won't corrode as easily. And that's just something I happen to know, that things that are nitrided tend to corrode a little faster. So that would be less prone to corrosion. Nitride would, of course, have better wear characteristics, but it rusts easily. And now they have black oxide. I don't have much about black oxide. I'm going to say it has better wear characteristics, and I think it's nitrided and black oxided to prevent the rust. Lycoming, they go in and out of nitride, right? I told you that. So yeah. So I've told you before, Lycoming, it has a straight bore. It's nitrided or not nitrided? Hey, you guys don't remember? Okay.
Nitrided.
Huh?
Nitrided.
No. Nice try, though. You had a 50% shot at that. All right. So nitride. So if it's a Lycoming and it's nitrided, it has choke. If it's plain steel and it's Lycoming, has no choke. In other words, they're straight bores. They make a big deal about that. So don't know why. It's like, I shouldn't say a big deal about it. It's a fact. You don't choke the straight bore. I don't know why. You just don't. But if you have the nitride cylinders in Lycoming, it has choke. Now Continental, as far as I know, they all nitrided. You would have no idea if you've got a non-nitrided or nitrided. I think it's just one of those things. Continental's like, well, yeah, we nitride them. What's the big deal? Lycoming actually goes so far as to color code their cylinders down. Not here. That's the spark plug. In a different spot because Lycomings are different. But they'll color code their cylinders. If you have a blue stripe on a Lycoming, it's nitrided. So it's like, oh yeah, you have to identify them from the outside. Ooh, that's nitrided. Like I said, they make a big deal. There is no such thing as striping a Continental for nitriding. It's like, it's just a cylinder. Don't worry about it. Yeah.
So how does that work with the striping on cylinders when they're overboard? Companies do that.
Yep. Well, then you kind of lose that. I was trying to find my color code stripes here. Yeah, I wanted to show you where it is. I don't know if I have a picture of that. I don't appear to have a picture of color coding. Oh well. Yeah, now you've seen all the slides. I would go home. Right in here. I have to look at it. Nope, because it's the bottom.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yep. Oh, it's no. Yeah, it's got to be on the top, and that doesn't give me a top view. Let's see. Nope, I don't like that one either. Anyway, I'll show you. I'll get one, bring it in here. Where am I? So back to my thing. So yes, Lycoming makes a deal about it. If it's nitrided, it's blue. It also has choke. If it's plain steel, it is not color coded, and it has. Weird that it works out that way, and they make a deal about it. Continental. How does Continental mark their cylinders if they're nitrided?
They're all nitrided.
They don't. It's like, yeah, they're all nitrided. Don't worry about it. Okay. So those are my non-plated. So non-plated, you can have plain steel, nitride, or now the black oxide. So if you look on the inside, it's all black, then it's black oxide. Okay, so then we have the plated bores. Plated. There are a lot of different plating. So we originally had the chrome. That's the OG, sometimes called cracked chrome or channel chrome. Cracked or channel chrome. It's the original. All right. Then after that, they decided. They came up with this ceramic coating mixed in with the chrome. So ceramic. And oh, by the way, this has orange stripe. Then they had ceramic, and it was under the trade name Sermachrome. And it was 2 black stripes. Why did I write that? Orange stripes. 2 orange stripes. That stuff sucked. Hated it.
And this is universal for cylinders?
Yeah, it was just these plating operations you could do. You'd send them out and get them plated. Some of these might have been offered by the factory. I just don't remember if that was the case or not, but I know we dealt with them. There was some aftermarket cylinder companies doing it, or you could, because when you're overhauling an engine, you have a lot of choices for what you want to do with cylinders. Well, you used to have more options. The options are fewer these days, I think, or maybe that's just in my opinion. What I would choose is becoming very limited. So we'll just say back in the day, somebody wanted their engine overhauled, And I would always include 3 quotes with it. I'm like, okay, here's the bottom end was always the same, and then we get the cylinders. I'm like, okay, here's your choices. Choice 1, overhaul your cylinders. Do it in-house right here. Or if they were cracked, we have to set them off. We can get them weld repaired. Which, by that time, the metallurgy is not that great. But it's a cheap way to get it done. If you're on a budget, we could do it. And so you get yours overhauled. Option 2 was we could buy overhauled cylinders. Like your cylinders are just no good. They're all cracked. The bores are wore out. We'd have to, they've already been bored oversized. It's just bad option. We'll go get you some overhauled cylinders somewhere else. And we could either get a complete overhaul cylinder or what's called a stud assembly, which is just a cylinder that didn't have any valves or anything, and we'd finish it off and put the valves in ourselves and seat them in and everything. Or you could go to an aftermarket, Superior. When I worked at ECI, used to have a great product. Or you could go to the factory. And when Superior and ECI Superior first came out, I mean, they just made the best small Continental cylinders without a doubt. They used investment casting. Everything worked. You could bump the timing up and get a little more power out of your engine. They were wonderful, and they were cheaper. And so then the OEM manufacturers, they started saying, well, Superiors, everybody's going to Superior, so they dropped their prices, increased their quality. So then it was like, well, one or the other, they're about the same, just depending on what you wanted to do. But some of these companies, like ECI, would offer their cylinders with a coating new, or when you ordered an overhauled cylinder, you could get them coated, chrome, Sermachrome. Sermachrome sucked. I just remember one particular engine we did for an overhaul, and I didn't do it, but I remember we did it, and it has this ceramic coating, and when we checked the oil right after the initial run-in, it was like a coating of ceramic or something right on the top. It was like foamy, and it was a layer, and I'm like, that just doesn't look right. I don't know. There was some real issues with break-in. Both of these can be difficult to break in. You can screw them up. So there was a problem with that. Then they said, well, okay, let's bring this one. Let's do this one. We'll go with the third one. I think this was the last one, a nickel coating. And we called it Sermanil. And oh, did I hate that one with a frickin' passion. It was, as this one guy said, the surface was harder than the hubs of hell. We had, I told you about this really incredible hone we had. We couldn't even use it on that. We had to get a handheld diamond hone that you had to order it from ECI. And it was diamond encrusted hone, and you had to use this special stuff. And you just had to do it by hand. This is all you could do. And so, that was 2 teal stripes. If I remember. Oh, no, it was a teal. One like teal, silver, teal, if I remember correctly. I don't know my memory. So I had a Sermanil cylinder in the shop, and I was changing out the guides in it. And so I had it in the flame oven. And I was doing something, and I heard something fall, and I looked over, and the entire coating fell out of the oven and landed on the floor. So I had a pile of Sermanil on the floor. I'm like, oh crap. I don't think it's supposed to do that. So I called the manufacturer. I'm like, yeah, we just had the whole coating fell out of the cylinder. What's up? Well, what kind of oven are you using? Well, it's a natural gas flame. Oh, you can't put a flame on that stuff. You can't. Huh. Seems like there'd be a flame when it's running. But so I'm like, okay. So they replaced the cylinder, for free, which is suspicious right there. We'll send you a new one at no cost, but definitely don't use a flame oven anymore. So I continued to use the flame oven, but I had a liner that went in and protect it, and I was always afraid every time I did it. I'm like, I'm going to drop the coating. So I hated it. You had to have very special rings for that. I don't remember what the ring material was, but it was special Sermanil rings. So what kind of ring would you use with chrome?
Not chrome.
Plain. Kind of ring would you use a Sermachrome. So plain. And then this was special. I don't remember what it was anymore. Let's see. What are the characteristics of rust? Characteristics. C-H-A-R-A-C-T-E-R-I-S-T-I-C. Characteristics of plating. Why would you ever want them plated? One, no rust. As an aircraft owner, my number 2 fear in life is rust of my engine from not running, sitting around. Mine's been sitting around for almost 2.5, 3 months now, and it's freaking me out. So you get a lot of rust, and so no rust. Don't have to worry about it. It really does have great wear because it's so hard. It is difficult to break in. That can lead to oil consumption issues. You could have to have special rings. Special rings, maybe. But you got to pay attention. Maybe now's a good time to talk about break-in. Yeah, what the hell, right? My class, I can talk whatever I want to. All right, so we talked about break-in, and remember one time my wife and I were looking at cars a long time ago. It was a Saturn. That's how long ago a Saturn just come out. And I remember going to test drive this guy. I'm like, so what kind of break-in do you need on this thing? There ain't no break-in. You don't break in these kind of engines. They're already. I'm like, okay. Once you know what break-in is, you're like, oh, yeah, you do. So on cylinders, and this is kind of my next point getting down here, I talk about honing them. So a hone is stones that will go around the cylinder and put a scuff mark on it. And when you look down in there, you get about a 45-degree pattern of scuffing across the cylinder. And this actually has a depth, and it can be measured with a profilometer, which apparently that's one of the ways. It's like I was told it's like a little record player, a little needle, and you can pull it across there and like plays a song. And, sounds like Jimi Hendrix, it's right. If it sounds like the Stones, it's, I don't know. Anyway, it would have sounded like the Stones, wouldn't it, if it was right? Okay, so you have this break-in. And if you look at it on a profile view, you have to think about it. It's kind of scratching in there, and it's making these ridges in there. And these ridges are sharp. And they have sharp points on them, and that's just what happens when you run stones around in circles inside of a cylinder, going up and down the cylinder bore. And then we have rings that go in there, and they're, I'll just put a ring like that. There's the piston. So the ring has to scrape against that. Well, what breaking in does is it wears off these high ridges. Now, we need the ridges, by the way, because the ridges are going to hold oil. We get oil in there. And that's a good thing because we want oil in there. But yet now we have the ridges right there. And the ridges are, they're kind of high and it's not seated well. So at the point where the engine breaks in, we knock off all the high spots and we leave more of a plateau, if you will. So they're kind of flat. And that flatness works out. So now we got oil sort of fills everything, and we can get to the rings. So the ring then has a flat surface to run against. Well, when that ring is against the flat surface, number one, it has a little more surface area, very small amount more, but more surface area. So it's against there, and we get a better seal so that we don't get combustion gases blowing through from the piston down. So it seals it up real nice. So that's breaking in. Well, to break in an engine, it requires a little bit of finesse. There are a couple of requirements. We'll talk about oil next week, but one of the requirements of breaking in is that you use the correct oil. And for the most part in aviation, we say use a straight mineral non-detergent oil, which is to say you use the lowest quality oil you can buy. And I'll more on that later. I don't buy that at all. And there's reasons why I don't. So anyway, so you use a low quality oil. Number two, you have to have higher compression happening in the engine so that the gases will go into your keystone rings, go into that gap, and force the ring out. You need pressure against the cylinder wall. If you don't, well, you're going to have problems. What you get is just the ring kind of rubbing up and down, not doing a whole lot of anything because there's no pressure pushing it in to wear off those spots. So it takes a long time to wear in. And 3, you've got to watch your temperatures, because if this oil starts to coke up and fill in these gap, because we know what coking is. That's when oil turns to that, like crystallizes. All right, we'll talk more about that. If the oil crystallizes in there, it ain't coming out. You just made a really hard surface there. So now you've filled it up with a hard surface. So it's hard surface, hard surface. There's nowhere for actual oil to be. And so you get a problem with that. And so the only way to get that is you have to take the cylinder apart and they'll rehone it, get rid of they call it the glaze on there. So you don't want it to glaze over. So you have all of these issues with trying to break in a cylinder. There's a major point I was trying to make with this, but that's what breaking in is. So it's actually really important. In having built engines, it's fun sometimes to talk to pilots who have broken in engines. There was a period of time where I always like to do all my run-ins on a test stand, and you didn't really see them break in on a test stand because of the way you run it per the manual. You do it a low RPM, then a little bit higher, and a little bit higher, and a little bit higher, and you don't. It takes a long time, and you wouldn't fly a plane like that. I can't fly a plane by, well, I'm doing 1,000 for a few minutes, then 1,500 for 10 more, then you can't go up in 100 RPM increments and take off. You need a very long runway. You got to full power it and take off, right? Climb to a safe altitude and then back off when you throttle some. So things are very different if you're going to break in an aircraft on the aircraft while you're flying it. So I've talked to pilots who've actually done that. Not the most legal or safe thing to do, but they say, especially with the Sermachrome and chrome cylinders, how interesting it is to watch temperatures go up, up, up. Oil temp goes up, cylinder head temp, they start climbing. They usually say it gets to the point where they start to get a little bit nervous, and then it just starts going the other way. And what that signifies to me is they've at least broken through the high ridges and they've started to get a good seal, which then the blow-by stops coming by quite so much. The rings are starting to attach, which is starting to bring down the cylinder head temps, which means the blow-by isn't getting into the oil, which means that oil isn't getting hot, so everything starts to cool back down. Of course, the danger with trying to break in an engine in flight, number one, well, what if the engine has a problem? You're in flight. 2, I said you need high pressure. The higher up in altitude you go to be safe, the lower the pressure is. So that doesn't work. Oh yeah, I was listening to the AOPA podcast, Ask the A&Ps. You guys listen to that at all?
AOP.
I'll just roll my eyes a little bit. Yeah, one of them was talking about, it's really fun to break in an engine on the aircraft, because basically what you do is you take off and you keep it, I like to go out over the ocean where I can keep it about 200, 300, 400 feet, 500 feet, and just firewall and just go. Like, well, you're not wrong, but it's a little sketch. So that's where break-in. I don't really see break-in as something that's happening around the bearings and the crankshaft and stuff like that. So when you use your crappy oil to break this in, then you have crappy oil elsewhere, and I don't love that. But more on that later. All right, because I can really go off on a tangent. Special rings, we got that. A little bit about boring oversize. So non-plated bores can sometimes be bored oversize. Can be bored oversize. Not all engines can you do this to. There's some that say, this particular engine, no. Like a lot of the turbocharged engines, they don't want you doing that. It could be, Lycoming has P10 and P20. Continental actually has 5 and 15, I think, are the common size. It's .005. but it's really not bored oversized there. It's just ward of 5 over and 15 over, which is actually 0.015, and P20 is 0.20, and P10 is 0.10. So sorry about that. Let's see. The P005 uses the same piston, but larger rings. And by the way, Continentals are measured very differently than Lycoming bores are. What can you bore a car to?
Typically 60.
60.
Yeah.
Okay, so automotive. We'll say that can go to 0.060. As we're limited, but aviation are limited to 0.020, and that's actually kind of rare. You may have a really, really hard time getting an 020 piston. They probably don't, I don't even think they make them for most Lycomings anymore. 10 is the max, really, for most engines, or 15 at Continental. So it's one thing, because of the thin wall, and to some extent, nitriding. So nitriding is only about 4 to 6 thousandths. So if I have a nitrided cylinder and I bore it 10 over or 15 over, how much nitriding you suppose I have left? About 0. And we don't re-nitride them.
Does that become a plain bore then?
Technically, I would say it is, but you're not, you still call it a nitrided bore, which is crazy. So if I had a plain bore cylinder and I bored it oversized, I would keep it a straight bore. If I had a nitrided bore and I bored it oversized, I had to keep it a choked bore, and I would still mark it as nitrided. So let me see. 2 types of bores. So two types of bores. There's the straight bore. Straight bore. 2 types of bores, a straight bore. Okay, so you know what that is. The diameter at the head is nearly the same as the opening. Now, if it was new, it would be exactly the same. But after it's been run a little bit, it's going to change some. Might even go into taper. But it was never made as a taper. And we have the, what's the next one? Choke bore. If anybody has a problem with the concept of choking makes something a little smaller, let me know. I've got a really good demonstration. I can help you remember that choking is smaller. I'm tenured.
That's something to do with shotgun.
Nah, just right in the throat. Is it harder to breathe? Yes, that's tighter. See? Diameter choke. So the diameter at head, this is the bore, is smaller than the opening. So choke. Choke is anywhere from 0.005 to 0.010 nowadays. Used to be much more than that, not much more, like 12. Why is it choked?
Put the head on?
To put the head on? Mm-mm. Nope. Heat expansion. Heat expansion causes choke to expand. Choke to expand to a straight bore. at operating temperatures. So in other words, if I started with the straight bore when it's cold, and by the time the engine's hot, now it's going like this, and the piston gets up here, and there's all this slop up there because it's too wide. So I don't want a straight bore. I want it tapered when it's cold. And then as the cylinder heats up, it's going to straighten out and be straight.
You want it choked as it.
I want it choked when it's cold.
Yeah, you said tapered.
Tapered in. Sorry. Thank you for that. So, choked. And then as it heats up, it'll go straight and run straight. As opposed to starting straight, then getting hot, then going tapered out. That was not desirable. We don't really want that. Do we? All right, can I move it?
Move it.
Kevin, I was going to ask,
I gotta
how
erase
bad
it.
is it when your engine is not warmed up and you have that choke on your cylinder? Is it damaging the piston at all, or?
There's supposed to be enough clearance that that doesn't happen. But I've never heard of anybody having a problem like, I used power when my engine was cold and now, this happened. It's not good for it, but I think I've never heard of anybody having a major issue with it or an issue at all. But then issues show up in weird ways. It's like, somebody does that all the time. It never hurt their engine, but then they're complaining, hey, I've only got 400 hours on my cylinder and the compression is really, really bad. And you take it apart and there's this huge wear step up at the top end, where it should be choked. You can see where the top ring stopped all the time. There's a big old step right there. And you're like, well, what caused that? Possibly that. So a lot of things show up in ways that it's like, I don't really know what caused it. Let me see, clear. And let's see. That's probably a really good spot to take a break, isn't it?
Break.